Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Megan Easley-Walsh, and this is History Stories. With a PhD in history, as an author, a writing consultant, and editor, my life is full of history and stories. With that in mind, this podcast's goal is to explore some of those stories of history. This will include diving into antiques and interesting historical artifacts that I've found, looking behind the scenes at inspiration for my novels, taking a peek at places I visited, and uncovering new topics of interest. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin. In my house, on top of my bookshelves, I have a couple of teddy bears with long histories stitched into them. These bears are made of quilts that my great-grandmother made. When she was 6 years old, she traveled with her family in a covered wagon to Oklahoma. My great-grandmother spent her life on a farm without running water, but with plenty of determination and family togetherness. The quilts made me think of my novel North Star Home, where Anne Scarlett and Nathaniel Cranber are on the western frontier. The year is 1875. Anne comes from Georgia and has had her family land stolen. She's on a mission to get it back, even if that means contending with the Yankee sheriff, even if that means getting caught red-handed by him and landing in a heap of trouble. They have to sort through that mess. Along the way, well, they might just learn that they actually have more in common than they thought. Last week, we spoke about the importance of having a guiding light. Many people use the North Star as a point of orientation to find their way home. In North Star Home, this also takes on a symbolic meaning. The historian John Henrik Clarke said, quote, "History is not everything, but it is a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography." End quote. Nathaniel and Anne were supposedly former enemies, but their values aligned as beautifully as a constellation on a clear night. Quilts, likewise, can be viewed as a means of human orientation, as they depict pieces of a life. In other words, a quilt tells a story, a personal history. Quilting circles, where many hands worked on a quilt, were opportunities to unite behind a common goal, share stories, and build a shared history. Quilting itself also has a history. Quilts are often associated with American pioneering history, but they exist in many other contexts as well. In medieval Europe, a quilted coat under armor was known as a gambeson. For those who could not afford armor, thick quilted coats offered an extra shield of protection. European exposure to the Indian cloth industry grew throughout the 17th and 18th century. These fabrics were known as chintz, and they had patterns printed on plain cotton fabric using wooden blocks. This added a decorative flair and color. Indian quilts were a popular import in the Netherlands and England during these centuries. Perhaps somewhat paradoxically for a craft that is handmade, industrialization enabled more people to participate in quilting. This is primarily because fabric gained greater widespread availability at affordable prices. The same efforts that had once been put into spinning and weaving was no longer necessary for the procurement of fabric. The piecing together of distinct fabrics in a pattern is known as patchwork, and this is the type of quilting that was used in the creation of the quilts that my bears are made of. I think it's appropriate that my bears sit on top of my books. Quilting is a rich heritage of pieces of personal history stitched together within the broader frame of international trade, industry, and cultural influences. Books, likewise, are assemblages of pieces of knowledge and lives, intersections of influences and research. Be they fiction or nonfiction, they are held together by the intent stitching of the author. I am reminded of the quotation by the author Richard Peck, quote, We write by the light of every story we have ever read." End quote. Some of the most beautiful patchwork quilts are assembled of a variety of pieces and colors. I think the same is true for life. We seek out new experiences, new foods to try, new places to visit, new books to read. I have spoken before about the idea that a book has to steep inside like tea in a teapot before it is written. I think part of that boiling water that is poured into that steeping teapot is the many books that authors read. The author Stephen King said, quote, "If you want to be a writer, you must do two things above all others: read a lot and write a lot." End quote. We use the same word as writers that quilters do. We are gathering material for our next project. Perhaps for the quilter, a piece of red from an old shirt, a piece of turquoise bought from a sale, a piece of white given by a friend are more obviously present. But for the writer, we too gather our materials: a thought-provoking image from another novel that just won't let us go, inspiration from a dinner in a new city, a piece of conversation overheard. To be clear, writers do not read because we're taking pieces of other authors' work, but rather because we're absorbing language into us. It becomes part of the alchemy of creation, a necessary component in the writing. In the words of author William H. Gass, quote, "The true alchemists do not change lead into gold. They change the world into words." End quote. In history stories, so far, we focused on my historical fiction when it comes to my novels. I do have other novels as well, though. If the idea of Western ranches excites you, then you might be interested to know that my newest novel, The Rancher's Secret, released last week on May 7th. It's a contemporary second-chance romance, and although different, of all of my historical novels, it's closest to the novel we've discussed in this podcast, North Star Home. Thank you for joining me for this episode of History Stories. To find out more about my writing and my research, visit me at meganeasley-walsh.com. You can find my novel, North Star Home, as well as my new release, The Rancher's Secret, on Amazon. I look forward to sharing more history stories with you in the next episode.